So this is one of those rare moments. Now I haven't even read into the article yet, so don't want to put my cart before the horse here. But it seems like one of those rare moments where you see a piece out of CBC that might at least be kind of objective and trying to speak truth to reason, right? Or trying to be a little bit sensible in its approach in regards to politics. Headline: Historians say removal not the only way to deal with racist relics. So this is in regards to the monuments and plaques, and I mean you've seen, like, especially by the collectivists, the progressives, right, the leftists among us. They're trying to do that revisionist aspect of history where they just remove all of history, right, as a means for what? What's the means? What is the end result? If you deny history, then how are you going to teach anyone in the future about some of the negative aspects of history? You will have nothing to point to. And this is probably where they're trying to go with this in this particular article. But if you think about the kind of groups or the kind of regimes or dictators of the past that have done the exact same thing, they're completely authoritarian in nature, right? I mean, look at even now. ISIS over in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq, and a lot of those places. They're doing the exact same thing. They're tearing down Christian statues or monuments or relics of the past. And what for? Because that does not negate or deny that history, right? So whether they agree with the history or not, by removing statues, they're basically trying to pretend as though that never happened. And I guess if they're trying to recruit new people into the Islamic faith, right? Well, wouldn't you want to point out, if you're against Christianity, what are you going to be able to tell your people in the future? It's like, hey, we're against this. Actually, I got nothing to point to because we removed it all, right? So no matter how you look at it, from any objective standpoint, it's just stupid, right? And I mean, think about it. They did that kind of stuff under a lot of these collectivist regimes, the communists and the socialists and the fascists in the past. They all did the same kind of stuff. And the left are putting forth the present that they have to do. And I love the way Trump handled it anyways. It's like, what? Oh, so now it's Robert E. Lee or any of these other political people of the past. What's next? George Washington? Jefferson, right? Because they owned slaves as well. So, right, it's this attempt to deny or neglect history or to have some kind of historical revisionism where you create your new history just by eliminating the old history and making up a new one. I mean, that's well, first of all, it's dishonest. There's nothing where you can point to and say, well, if we do this, it'll be better in the long run. I don't know how you could put forth and present that kind of narrative of dialogue considering you're literally trying to deny history. It's like me. It's like if you burnt your hand on a stove, right? Think about this. I mean, I love using different examples. Think about if you, when you were younger, maybe a little bit naive and didn't quite understand, all the aspects of, the elements on a stove. They get very hot to the point where, you shouldn't touch them. But let's say at some stage when you were growing up, you touched them. It was the fact that you touched that stove that taught you, I don't want everyone to ever do that again because it'll burn my fingers. But if you remove that from your psychology, from the history, from your memory banks, you may very well repeat that same mistake again. So having that history, having that precedent at the forefront of your mind, or at least obtainable if you want, that's important. That's how you kind of prevent history from repeating itself. But once again, these people, they don't think logically or objectively or anything remotely consistent as far as proper intellect goes. They're just trying to use their emotional based rhetoric and emotional based ideology or preference on their own to just try to negate or deny that there's a world outside of their own particular echo chamber. That's what we're talking about here. I'll read a little bit into the article. As momentum builds to tear down monuments and rename buildings that are deemed racist relics of the past, some historians say offensive memorials should remain intact to deepen education and even bridge divides. Well, man after my own heart, apparently, or men or women, or multiple men, multiple women, right? Hey. Hundreds of statues remain across the U.S. in the wake of the Civil War, marking military figures on or battle sites, and there is a growing push to remove what many regard as lingering symbols that glorify slavery and the oppression of black Americans. Similar disputes have erupted in Canada over commemorative names and statues of historic figures who had a role in the cultural oppression of indigenous people. So once again, but what are they turning to, these indigenous people? They're turning to the state, to government, right? Like, what the... Anyways, just come on. I mean, this missing and murdered indigenous women inquiry is put forth and presented and paid for by federal funds, like the government, the central plan. You know, the people that you're all against, but you seem to, like, you see how cozy that relationship can be if it's to their benefit, and how they quickly can reject it if it doesn't go along with what they want, or the premise, or the edicts, or the preferences that they want to put forth, right? This is the part that just, I mean, it's like such an intellectual failure on so many levels. The trend to remove those memorials, many of which are displayed in prominent public places featuring figures in heroic poses, such as riding on horseback, have provoked strong emotions and violent clashes. Particularly because those in the media, especially those in the CBC and a lot of the established media, they're stoking up those fucking fears and hatred and division. They're stirring that pot constantly, and then they're like, oh, look, now we can report on the consequence or the effect of what we've been putting forth and presenting as a narrative, as the dialogue, right? Holy shit. Problem, reaction, solution. Yep, that's government for you. But leading historian and author Jack Granatstein said that rather than allowing these sites to become flashpoints for racial divisions, they should be displayed with contextual information to help people understand, interpret, and learn from the past. And Granatstein sounds like Jack may very well be Jewish, and I'm sure that's the thing with the Jewish people. Would they want all the relics or the remnants of the Holocaust to be removed, right? I'm pretty sure they want that to remain so that they can point to the historical precedent and say, listen, we don't want this to ever be repeated again, right? That's probably why someone like Jack here would be in complete opposition to the removal of that historical wrongdoing, misdeeds, and vile, evil acts and behaviors that were carried out by, people of particular ideological preferences, collectivists, right? So Jack here is trying to point out that no, don't remove that, because if we didn't have the Holocaust to point to, you may very well see in this modern era, in this modern age, a lot of people having a lot of backlash or hatred or envy towards the Jewish people. Once again, history may very well much repeat itself if it wasn't for the fact that we can point to the fact that look at the consequence, look at the result of this kind of hatred, this kind of division, right? This kind of identity politics. It's probably inflaming the situation, Grindstein said, of the push to eliminate memorials. I think we need to remember that history happened, and you don't simply change it by taking a name off a building or taking down a statue. Right on, Jack. I think what is better than that is to have an explanation for why someone is being honored for what he or she did in that time. And that explanation can go into the context of what they did, right? That's what history is all about. What are you going to teach people in history class once you remove all this stuff, right? What was the point of even having a history class, right? Grandstein said taking down monuments allows the wrong people to seize control over the interpretation of history, referring to those who have staged demonstrations protesting the removal, including white supremacists. In the American context, and to some extent the Canadian context, you give the opportunity to people whose views we don't particularly enjoy, fascists, Nazis, racists, he said. I don't want them pretending to defend history. The history they are trying to create is not the history I would prefer to see memorialized or honored or understood by the public. White nationalists protesting the planned removal of a statue memorializing Robert E. Lee, a Confederate top general, clashed violently with counter-demonstrators in Charlottesville, Virginia last weekend. One woman was killed and another 20 people were injured. It was the latest in a growing number of controversies that have erupted over plans to take down Confederate symbols in the U.S. and to change names of sites offensive to Indigenous people in Canada. With a growing push to remove historical memorials and monikers, Grandstein asked where it should stop. He noted that in Canada, CBC listeners called Tommy Douglas the greatest Canadian of all time, yet in the 1930s, the former Premier of Saskatchewan and father of Medicare held a then popular belief in eugenics and wanted to sterilize people with mental impairments, right? Right? You need this kind of history to point this stuff out. Attitudes change, and it seems to me that one of the tasks of historians and politicians is to remind people that today's values are different than past values, and the future values will probably be different than ours, Grandstein said. So I'm not going to read any more into this particular article. I'll put a link to it in the description of the video below. But yes, I agree wholeheartedly with the sentiment from this gentleman, from Jack here in particular, that yes, trying to remove these things from history, trying to rewrite history or pretend that history didn't happen, that is not the way to go forward. Not now in the present, and certainly not in the future. People need to understand so they have something to reflect on and some kind of precedent to point at and say, listen, we don't want to repeat this stuff. You remove that from the equation completely, or from the minds of the people completely, then, like I said, everything then is up in the air and open to interpretation to the point where, it's completely subjective. There is no longer any objective reality to point to or to say this is something you don't want to do. This is something you don't want to repeat. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.